Hey, fourth grade, we're about to read Chapter 13 in the Aurora County All-Stars. Chapter 12 ended with such a cliffhanger. Here's the end of Chapter 12, just to remind you where we left off. He whirled. A flashlight beam struck him in the eyes and blinded him. He stumbled backward into a narrow table against the hallway wall. A scream gargled in his throat as a hand clapped itself over his mouth. Someone else's hand. A cold hand. A ghost. So that was the end of Chapter 12. House is in Norwood Boyd's home at night, and somebody else is in there. So we are going to find out what happens next. Chapter 13 starts with a quote by Walt Whitman. Each of us inevitable, each of us limitless, each of us with his or her right upon the earth. All right, here we go. House strangled on his screams. He flailed his arms as if he could shoo away whatever was upon him. He twisted himself away. Whoa, son! It was a man's voice, not a ghost's. A voice, alive and strong, breaking through the dark, through the flashlight's beam. House thudded to the floor with a yelp. "Hush, child," said the voice. "No need to scream to the high heavens." Pip! House squinted into the dancing light. Now he could see him. Parting shots. Francis's great-grandfather. Pip extended a knobby hand to House. House tried to think of something to say, but his heart was still in his throat and he couldn't breathe. "Give me your hand," said Pip. House did as he was told, and Pip pulled him to his feet. House sucked in as much air as he could, which set him to coughing. Pip slapped him on the back until he stopped. "Nobody's going to get you," he said. "What are you doing here, House?" Eudora Welty trotted down the hallway and blinked at them. House pointed to her. "Dog," he said. "Dog." Pip called Eudora to him and scratched her back. "I'll bet she's feeling lost." "Yes, sir." House tried to breathe slowly. He was lightheaded. "Well," said Pip, "she's used to you being here, so maybe that's a comfort to her right now." He gave Eudora a last pat on the head. "You find Norwood this morning?" House colored up. "Yes, sir," he said. He willed Pip not to ask him any more questions. "Thought so," said Pip. "I figured it was you who called it in. What are you doing here now?" House touched Eudora between her ears. "I figure she needs looking after." "You going to take her home?" asked Pip. House shrugged. "I thought I might." "You come over mighty late." House concentrated on scratching Eudora's ears. "Yes, sir." It was all he could think to say while he waited for his heartbeat to return to normal. Pip persisted as if he were asking test questions. "Where did you find her?" "Under the honeysuckle bush," said House. "But you're in the house." "Well," Pip nodded. He seemed satisfied. He didn't ask for more, but House did. He asked before he even let himself think about it. "You're in the house too, Mr. Pip." "Yes, I am," said Pip. He didn't offer an explanation. House searched for something to say as Pip stared at him. "You've got real cold hands," he finally said. "I'm old," said Pip. "I don't have much heat left in me." "You don't?" "Folks get old and they don't move as much as they used to," said Pip. He hiked up his pants by the belt. "Don't be so shocked. You've seen me here with Norwood when you've come." "Yes, sir," said House. "You brought supper." "Yes, sometimes I did. That's a fact," said Pip. "But that's not all of it." House shoved his hands in his pockets. His note was hot, like it was on fire for House to hurry up and do something about it. And here was Pip about to send him home. Pip gazed at House thoughtfully, like he was making up his mind about something. Then he gestured to a place across the hall. "Look here. I'll show you something you haven't seen." Pip played his flashlight over the walls. Every inch was covered with framed black and white photographs. Faces floated into the yellow cone of light and faded away like ghosts. "Do you know who those folks are?" Pip asked. House shook his head no. "Right here," said Pip, pointing to a young black boy wearing a baseball uniform several sizes too large for him. Aurora Angels was sewn onto the jersey in a beautiful sky blue script. It could have spelled out Los Angeles Dodgers, as beautifully made as that uniform was. "This is me," said Pip. House squinted as Pip steadied the light. "Don't you wonder about it?" Pip asked. House nodded. He couldn't take his eyes off the uniform. "We had a Little League team?" "Somebody did," said Pip, "but there wasn't no we about it." "You're wearing a uniform," said House. "It wasn't mine." "Whose was it?" "Good question. It was a long time ago." Pip settled into the story. "I was 12, like you are today. I was the best home run hitter in 3 counties, and I couldn't play baseball with the Aurora County boys." Pip leaned toward House. "I wasn't allowed." House could feel Pip's breath on him like a scratchy wool blanket. "Why not?" Pip sniffed. "I wasn't allowed to play because of the color of my skin," he said in a flat voice. "Just like old Satchel Paige, best pitcher who ever lived, wasn't allowed to play in the major leagues, had to stay in the Negro leagues nearly his whole career. I couldn't play with the white boys." House blinked into Pip's stare. "Really?" "Really." Pip crossed his arms, and the cone of light bobbed along the floor. "Norwood Boyd was my best friend," Pip continued. "My mama used to work for his mama, and we played together all day long as little boys, but once we started school, we didn't play together anymore. We went to different schools, we had different lives, and we didn't play baseball together. No siree. That's the way it was then." "How did you get the uniform?" House whispered. Pip hitched up his pants. "It was Norwood's. Norwood was a great ball player. He was a catcher, as good as Johnny Bench, as good as Josh Gibson, Roy Campanella. Did you know that?" House shook his head. It was unbelievable to think of that old man in the carved rosewood bed as a baseball catcher as good as Johnny Bench. "Norwood could throw clean from home plate to second and get that runner out," Pip continued. "But I couldn't play with him. No siree, I couldn't even watch him play unless I watched from the road. And I was some hitter. I could hit that ball like Ted Williams, like Babe Ruth. I could have been as good as Frank Robinson." House thought of Klebo, who loved baseball, whose skin was a darker brown than Pip's. House had been playing ball with Klebo ever since he could remember. Pip played the flashlight's beam on the photographs again. When Norwood got to be 12, he decided he wouldn't play baseball neither, if I couldn't play. He gave me his uniform. House and Pip both stared at the photograph in the cone of light. In the photograph, Pip's eyes were crinkled with happiness, and an ease seeped out of his pores. You could see it in his stance. Norwood took this picture of me in his uniform, took it with his Kodak camera, and for a while we played catch together. Then we quit. The joy went right out of baseball for both of us. I don't know to this day who I felt worse about, me, who couldn't play at all, or Norwood, who refused to play. It didn't make sense. Pip leaned close to House to make his last point. Norwood Boyd never again played for a ball team. And you know something? Pip clapped his hand on House's shoulder. Norwood was a young boy then. He was full of the fire of living, like all young folks are, like you are. What would lead a young boy to make a decision like that? To abandon something he loved so much to stand up for someone else? I don't know. House's voice was a whisper. Maybe he stood up for himself, said Pip. Think about it. Maybe he stood up for all of us. Look here. Pip illuminated photograph after dusty photograph with the flashlight, and House took them all in for the first time. Here was young Norwood Boyd, older Norwood Boyd with parting shots, Norwood Boyd with people House didn't know, so many people. And when he grew up, he joined the Merchant Marines, said Pip. Just look at everywhere he traveled, at everything he did. Then he ended up in this house, alone, these past many years, for reasons of his own. And that was when Pip surprised House. I loved Norwood Boyd for that one act of friendship. Why did you love him? That's the end of chapter 13. So 4th grade. We figured some things out. We had some questions answered. There was not a ghost in the house. It was Francis's grandfather, Parting Shots, whose nickname is Pip. And we just learned a lot about Norwood Boyd. Earlier in the book, all the kids in the book called Norwood Boyd Baby Eater Boyd and had all these little rumors and stories about him. And we just learned something totally different about this character. I bet you have a lot of questions right now wondering maybe how those rumors got started. How did kids come to make up those stories when it seems like there's another side of him? It seems like there's this social justice side of him, of standing up for what he believes in and standing up for what's right. Another thing I want you to be thinking about after this chapter is the time period, right? Think about what time period we've learned about in class that kind of reminds you about what Norwood Boyd and Pip lived through, that idea of segregation. Think back to some of the conversations we've had about the civil rights movement, and see if you can kind of place that time period in your head. And obviously, House is a boy in the story and is much younger, and so he's growing up in a different time. And there was a part of this chapter where House seemed quite surprised when Pip said, I wasn't allowed to play baseball with Norwood Boyd, and House said, really? I think that also shows you that House is living in a different time. And House thinks about his friend Klebo and thinks about how Klebo is black and he plays baseball with Klebo, and it's hard for him to imagine that kind of a reality of not being able to play with his best friend who happens to be a different race than he is. So there's a lot of thoughts kind of going around in my head after this chapter. A lot's going on here. We just learned a ton about Norwood Boyd that we didn't know before. His character has been pretty mysterious, and now we're slowly getting little bits of information about him, which is interesting. All right, we'll wait for chapter 14, but I hope you enjoyed today's read aloud, and I will see you all tomorrow. Bye.